I'm Paul Whitfield, I'm the Director General of Wildwood Trust. Wildwood is a native species charity. We're based in Kent, just outside Canterbury, literally 5 miles away from here. And our mission is protecting, conserving and rewilding British wildlife. So everything we do is relates to native species. We've got 12 currently active native species reintroduction and translocation projects, everything from the bison and the bleam to the choughs in Dover, but we're also working with dormice and water voles and white storks, many species that we are breeding at our centres, our conservation breeding centres, and releasing back into the wild, trying to restore some of what we've lost. We're standing here on the really interesting acid grassland that's part of Old Park, and it's a really important, precious piece of habitat right next to the centre of Canterbury, really. This is such an important green lung for the city, and it forms a really essential bit of nature that's just on people's doorsteps. It's really important that we identify places like this and we do whatever we can to keep them safe from development. These are really precious habitats for all sorts of creatures and plants, and it's so essential that we protect these important areas. So this piece of habitat, this lovely bit of woodland and grassland we've got here, it's connected down to the Stour, that connects into Stodmarsh, which eventually connects into the whole Blean. So this little green space just by Canterbury links all the way around into the Blean, all the way around the north of Canterbury, and forms a really important connected habitat. And what's so important is not that we just have these little protected areas, but we make those areas bigger, more connected, and we manage them better. We manage them better for nature. We allow the natural processes to return to these sites and become, havens for biodiversity. If we get things right here, this could be an explosion of biodiversity and bioabundance right on the doorstep of Canterbury. So, the government's ambition is that we have 30% of our land working for nature by 2030. And we can only achieve that if we find spaces like this and ensure that they're not developed and that they are kept for nature. And again, that we connect it to other areas that have been preserved for nature and create those large areas of connectivity where you've got movement of animals and species throughout the area, and that way you haven't got these little tiny sort of isolated spots that are fragmented, which we've got all over the country. We've got to find those spots, keep them safe and connect them to each other. That's a really, really important part of what we need to do to reverse the biodiversity crisis. An international ambition to really ensure that we've got enough space left working for nature. So at the moment the UK is in a really terrible biodiversity crisis. A huge number of our species are threatened with extinction. We're at risk of losing things like our hedgehogs, which to me is just incredibly depressing. And it just shows that the way we've been trying to look after nature just hasn't worked. We've got to have these bigger, more connected, more joined up areas for nature that are being managed in a very different way, that works with nature rather than against it. Humans try and manage things in a very meticulous, careful and tidy way, but nature isn't like that. Nature's chaotic and messy. I always say to people, an ecosystem is a system. It should be in a constant state of change, not a static sort of habitat that we're maintaining and looking after as people, trying to preserve little tiny niches. What we need to do is create large wild areas. Wildwood was named Wildwood because that's what we wanted to bring back. We wanted to create wild spaces of woodland where, as you walk through the wood, you come across the species that should be here, the species that we've wiped out. This grassland here should have large herbivores grazing upon it, maintaining the grassland, but also keeping it in a constant change, constant state of flux, creating lots of edges, because that's where all the other species will thrive and develop and find their little tiny habitats that they need. Something like cattle here, with dung, if we haven't got ivermectin in it, it's going to become an enormously important food source for insects, which will feed birds and will feed bats and will feed reptiles, and we can start to rebuild the food web that's just disappeared from a lot of our habitats. And that's exactly what we need here. Ivermectin is a drug that's given to pretty much all grazing cattle to remove parasites. But what it means is their dung is toxic to insects. And so rather than being an incredibly rich source of nutrients, it becomes poisonous and it doesn't support life. And you need to take these poisons out of the system. Dung is an incredibly important part of the ecosystem. where we have bison back in the Blean, we now have tens of thousands of dung beetles living in the dung, and they are food for all sorts of creatures, but also they're burying the dung. They are little carbon capture robots, effectively, just digging holes, putting dung in it, and storing carbon in the soil. An area like this, it's also really important that it's preserved and maintained and managed properly, because it will capture and soak up enormous amounts of carbon if we allow it to do it properly. The biodiversity crisis, the carbon crisis are two linked crises, and the solution is also linked. It's nature, it's trees, it's bringing back those natural processes that will store more carbon, but also be more resilient to the changes of climate change that we've already got. We're already getting hotter, drier summers and wetter, more horrible winters, and that creates far more risk for disease. So complex, rich habitats that are constantly changing, far more adaptable to the changes that are going to come, and far more resilient to some of those changes. Ash living in a complex woodland system are far more resilient to ash dieback than areas where you've got ash monoculture. So there's a real issue at the moment. People are not connected to nature. There's a nature deficit disorder. People just aren't spending time in nature, they don't understand nature, and they're just not connected to the natural world. And if people aren't connected and don't care, they're not going to do anything to try and help it. So spaces like this, where people can literally walk out of their doors and be in such a beautiful natural space, it's really important, not just for their mental health, but for their physical health, but for their feeling connected to it, feeling a part of it. And it's only through that people take action to try and save it. So yeah, I encourage everyone to come and walk around here. It's a beautiful place. So places like this are incredibly precious. They're close to where people live. They're very accessible. And there's such wonderful nature here. It's a great place for people to come and spend just a little bit of time in a green space, away from their sort of the city and their houses and the boxes that we all spend our lives living in, and away from screens too. This place is good for the soul, and it's really important that we keep it for those people. So one of the things we've got to do, it's a huge thing, it's a politically driven thing, is making space for nature. We've got to create spaces where nature can thrive, and it's already a place where it is thriving, and it's so essential that we keep it, making space for nature so that it's got enough room to thrive and survive and to persevere. The university's got a lot of funding to do a lot of this work, in Kent at Durrell Institute. It's so essential that these spaces are part of making space for nature. We've got a local nature recovery strategy that's been developed, and that's supposed to identify those really important spaces for nature and ensure they're not developed. We haven't got that in place yet, but this has to be part of that plan. It's a really important habitat, it's connected to other habitats, and we can't allow it to be built on.